Hey, Xkul. Xkul's eyes opened. He sucked in a deep breath. I'm up. What's going on? Nothing, Fences said. They're getting ready to move. Xkul sat up from the floor, wiping the crust out of his eyes. Light leaked through the slits of the nearby shutters. What time is it? He asked. Mid-morning, Fences replied. Elinkra wants to move while we have daylight. It wasn't much, but some sleep was better than none. They had slowly regained their senses and bearings after the blind flight into the night, curving back to the road following the Roland Gork. From there, they followed it east, stopping at the next human clan hold to rest. The place had long been emptied, with the humans being moved away from the river by the local tribes to keep them from randomly being eaten by passing migrants. As such, Elinkra's exhausted warband and its tag-along could rest in any den they pleased. Most chose the buildings around the hold's central clearing, however, and Xkul found that they were far from the only people who had escaped the city when he went to open the shutters. How many people got out? He asked as he scanned the mix of beastmen and humans huddling around the clearing. I don't know, Fences said. Lots. Since we were the first ones in, Elinver wants us to blaze the trail east and secure the next hold. Xkul turned away from the window. How long have you been up for? Not long. The lords were discussing it in the clearing. Can the Irma keep up with us? Elinkra said they could. It was probably true, but he still had his doubts about the decision. If it were up to him, he would have reorganized things sooner rather than later, assigning the Na, Irma and Osalo to protect the civilians and humans while the Lup, Gao and Kon found out to screen ahead. Warriors were better than civilians when it came to their long-range endurance, but they still were what they were, and they had just come out of an intense battle. Did we get the barges out? Yeah, but we have far from enough. Less than a dozen barges. They're shipping the civilians upriver first. Maybe that was why. With fewer to protect, they were using their extra strength to form mixed groups that could strike at the undead as they advanced. That was good. So long as they maintained discipline, purpose, and the will to fight, they wouldn't be beaten so easily by the teeming hordes of the undead. Xkul paced around the room, stretching away the last bits of his sleepiness before shaking out his coat. His stomach growled. Do they have food? Yeah, Fences said. The non-combatants moved supplies out on a bunch of wagons. After equipping his things, Xkul stepped out of the den and into the clearing. A light mist lingered in the streets of the hold, and only a few people were awake and moving about. He raised his nose into the air, following the scent of preserved meat. To the side of the clearing, he found a cart with several Irma warriors standing guard over it. Elinkra rose to his feet as Xkul and Fences approached. Good work last night, he said. Ready for more? Ready or not, Xkul replied, we do what we must. The Irma Lord shook his mane in approval. Well said. Here, eat your fill, you'll need it. Xkul took a strip of meat into his mouth, savoring the salty sweetness of nug imported from the jungles of home. Back when he had lived there, it was an everyday staple for the poorest of the poor. Now, it seemed like a rare delicacy. Thanks for coming down for us last night, Xkul said. And sorry. There's nothing for you to be sorry for, Elinkra replied. That, whatever it was, played us good. My clan lost a quarter of its mystics, and mystics from the tribes fighting nearby got caught up in it as well. Whatever it was. You felt it, too? I did. I doubt anyone didn't. The elder liches that Clan Torika warned us about were everything they claimed, but that presence lurking behind them was far worse. Did you see what it was? No. Elinver said that more strong undead appeared after we broke out, but they weren't the same thing. Elinver made it, huh? How many got out of the city? The civilians were evacuated safely, Elinkra replied. Most of our warriors, as well. The ones that volunteered to act as the rearguard didn't make it. What about the humans? A few hundred. The damn fools didn't want to leave. The undead stormed the walls before we could force most of them to come with us. How many thousands did that add to the numbers of the undead? He knew humans were small-minded, but couldn't they understand even that much? Where are the undead now? Xkul asked. There are no signs of pursuit, Elinkra answered. They're probably feasting on those idiot humans. What about the countryside? If what you said before the fight started last night is still true, the undead might have overtaken our flanks. That's why we're heading out, the Overlord said. Elenvez sent 24 warbands to secure the road east. Your usual warband is being added to mine for this, and we're to destroy any undead that have gotten ahead of us. Xkul nodded. It was a simple enough combination. The Lup would sniff out any undead, and the Irma would tear apart anything that couldn't be handled through skirmishing alone. They departed a half-hour later, feet splashing over the stone road as they padded along at a quick jog. The downpour of the previous night had settled into a drizzle, though the many rivers and streams they crossed were still swollen with runoff. To the south, the silt-laden rolling gorge dominated the landscape. Think they could come out of the river? Fences asked. I don't see why not, Xkul answered. Whether they can advance directly against the current is another question. Even the strongest swimmer can be washed away by the smallest river during the deluge. His gaze followed a pair of hunters assigned to the shore, then it turned away, crossing the road to the waterlogged fields in the north. Even with the weather like this, he said, they should still be faster overland. You've heard the stories, they're slow when they haven't caught your scent, but they never tire. Every second we stop is a second they have to catch up. These humans space their holds at annoying distances, too, Fences said. 30 kilometers is too far for our Nar and Irma civilians to travel in one day. It's why they're sticking them in the barges first, I guess. The ships will be back for another trip by the evening, too. Maybe they'll bring back more with them and we can all get out of here. If only life were so convenient, Xkul grunted. An hour later, thick columns of smoke along the riverbank confirmed that life was, indeed, not so convenient. Their 2 warbands ran to the shore, finding hundreds of beastmen dragging themselves out of the water. They're not undead, right? Fences stopped a few meters away from the closest of them. Of course not, Xkul rushed forward, wading into the water to help a con mother and her children ashore. What happened, miss? The boats, she gasped for breath. Fire. Hundreds of other warriors rushed to the aid of the civilians being washed downstream. The river was filled with bobbing heads trying to escape the current. Did the undead do it? Fences dragged another group out of the water. Who else would have done it? Xkul said, fires don't just accidentally happen during the deluge. Did you see how it happened? The miserable-looking survivors nearby looked to one another. No, someone said. I don't understand it. The barges were packed. We should have noticed something, but then, suddenly fires started springing up everywhere. We doused them with water from the river, but they wouldn't go out. Magic? He recalled the Elder Lich's conflagration on the wall. Their attack had come out of nowhere, too. What do you think? He asked a nearby mystic. We know too little about what these undead magic casters are capable of, she replied, but there are countless spells that produce flames. One can only assume that it's well within the realm of possibility. Xkul looked upriver to the burnt-out remains of the closest barge, which had been hastily run aground to save its passengers. The ships further from shore had become little more than bits of flaming wreckage floating by. If river transportation could be so easily denied to them, their situation was far worse than they initially expected. Once they could no longer spot anyone in the water, Xkul and Fences returned to the road where Elinkra and Anjaka, Xkul and Fences chieftain and the leader of their warband, were looking out over the mass of shipwrecked civilians. Xkul, Anjaka said, how many were on your part of the shore? About 100, Xkul replied. It looks like most survived, Elinkra said. But that's close to 2,000 people requiring escort. If the undead hit us now. Never mind now, Anjaka snorted. These people won't get far as they are. We're going to have to put them up in the next human village so they can rest. And who will guard them? We won't have to wait for long. More warbands escorting the remaining civilians should be on the way. My scouts say that it's clear. Elinkra blew out a loud sigh. There's that, at least. The warbands were instructed to help the civilians to the nearby village, which wasn't anywhere near large enough to accommodate them all. Every building was filled and those who couldn't fit inside huddled under the eaves trying to dry themselves off. Fences were taken apart and bonfires lit, the soaked wood adding more columns of smoke to the morning sky. At least the people behind us should see that something's wrong, Xkul said as they patrolled the village perimeter. Do you think the undead went out to attack the boats on purpose? Fences asked. Of course they did, Xkul spat. They have no honor whatsoever. Any warrior with half a lick of sense understood what was going on. The Elder Liches could fly, meaning that they could attack anywhere at their leisure. Yet, they had only done so at 2 points. The first was when Elinkra rallied the defenders of the western wall to rescue the hunters that had fallen into the swarms of undead. It was a feat of valor that any clan would gladly have their bards boast of in song. As if to quench the elation that came with that glorious moment, the Elder Liches had appeared to wreak havoc. Now, they had burnt their ships and with it any hope for an expeditious retreat. He knew what would happen next. The civilians would be subjected to the same arduous flight that those bare few in the west had survived, and the warrior clans were honor-bound to protect them. In a single act of cold calculation, their fates had been set on a predictable course. He shuddered as he recalled the dread presence they had felt over the city. It was as if a vile harbinger of darkness had appeared, delivering a wordless whisper of the terrors to come. "Ah, you didn't catch anything, did you?" Fences eyed him warily. "Huh? You just shivered like you had a chill. One of those ghouls didn't bite you, did they?" "I'm fine," Skull said. "Something scratched my back last night, but a mystic on the wall healed it. And then that mystic got scoured off the wall by a blazing inferno." He didn't want to remember it. His eyes wandered over the ground ahead of them, stopping at a smooth stone half buried in the mud. He knelt to pick it up, adding it to his poorly stocked pouch of bullets. "Make sure you have ammunition as well," he said. "If those damn things come flying in again." Aha. They mindlessly patrolled the premises for the next hour, at which point the first of the groups following after them from the city appeared on the horizon. An Overlord ran up to the village with his retinue. "What's going on here?" he said. "Where did all these people come from?" "The Elder Liches attacked the ships that left ahead of us," Skull said. "They're resting here for now." "Just great. Is Elinkra here?" Skull bobbed his head and led the Lord to Elinkra and Injaka. There was little they could come up with between them, so the Overlord was left with the survivors while Elinkra and Injaka departed to carry out their original orders. The rain picked up as the day went on, otherwise, it was uneventful. They didn't grow lax in their vigilance, however, scrutinizing the riverbank and rows of vineyards along the road. When they arrived at their destination, they were surprised to find a few warbands already occupying it. The scents on the eastern winds proved that they were of the living. Elinkra looked up at the gatehouse through the downpour, shading his eyes with a paw. "Who goes there?" he shouted. "Gao Korma and its constituent tribes." One of the Gao shouted back down at them, "Most of them, anyway. We're on the way to Taraka, but we stopped here for the night." Gao Korma managed the lands northeast of the human city they had just evacuated. Since the undead were reportedly advancing along the entire front, it made sense that they would head for the Rolengork on the way to the city on the lake that served as Clan Torika's hold. "This is bad," Elinkra muttered under his breath. Skull gave the Overlord a sidelong glance. With so many civilians on their hands, he could only think that having more warriors around to protect them was a good thing. Once the sentries granted them passage, Elinkra made his way straight to the center of the hold, his black mane tossing in the wind as he scanned the surroundings. Gao Korma wasn't a small clan by any measure, and Skull guessed that there were several thousand warriors plus 5 times their number of civilians present in the hold and its surroundings. Much like the one that they had come from, people were trying to make the best of an unexpected situation, with tribes dividing the area between them. They found the clan lord on the southern side of the clan's central clearing, conferring with 24 tribal chieftains. They turned at the sound of Elinkra's approach. "You too?" the Gao lord said. "Everyone, going by the number of runners that reached us," Elinkra replied. "When did you arrive in this hold, Elinkra?" "The first of us arrived 3 hours ago," Elinkra told them. "People are still trickling in. There weren't any boats moored here, but I sent a pack of hunters across the Rolengork to Torika. They should be back with some ships late this afternoon." "Didn't you see the No, never mind," Elinkra released a tired sigh. "Those who have rested the longest need to continue moving east. We have at least 50,000 coming from the west." 50,000, did you fight at all?" "For about half of last night. We destroyed thousands of undead, but more kept coming. Those Elder Liches they've been talking about showed up, and there's something worse behind them. Elinver made the call to withdraw after we found out what was going on across the entire front." Elinkra and his chieftains spent several moments silently digesting the information. Since you came out of the city relatively unscathed, Ilinkau said, can we offer resistance at every town along the way? We'll have 80,000 between us. I don't doubt that we could, Ilinkau said, and we will probably have to. The undead horde's behavior has clearly changed. There is some malevolent will actively directing them now. They're using tactics we've never seen before. Speaking of which, I hope those boats you sent for never come. Why? The barges that we were using to transport our people were destroyed in transit. I was going to ask if you saw the columns of smoke downriver, but you probably sent those runners hours before then. What did it cost the undead to do that? Ilinkau asked. Nothing, as far as we could see, Ilinkau answered. The ships just went up in flames on the river while it was raining. Ilinkau Gawokoma looked down, pressing a paw to the back of his neck. Xkul's mouth fell open in dismay as he realized the implications that Ilinkau was pointing out. Crossing the Rolengork during the deluge was impossible for most without using ships. With the undead destroying those ships, everyone north of the river was effectively separated from those in the south. Their new destination was the human city on the border of the jungle, some 100-odd kilometers away. We'll get our people going, Ilinkau said. Every group that comes in will be allowed 4 hours of rest. Does that sound alright? It will be prudent to split up the races, as well, Ilinkau nodded. The Gao and Lup civilians can cover the distance in 2 days or so. It will take the Na and Irma 3 times as long. The Forerunners shouldn't need an escort, so we can dedicate all of our forces towards delaying the undead advance. I'm sure Ilinver will find the reasoning sound. By the way, where are your humans? Ilinkau exchanged glances with his chieftains. They were, sedated, if you can call it that. We used the stuff that Sage KHHSCHLR distributed to pacify them while our defenders were busy. Those humans weren't going anywhere unless we planned on carrying them. I'm glad we didn't use that stuff, Ilinkau said. Ilinver and the others don't trust that Sage any further than they can throw her, so he just left her delivery to rot. If the entire countryside was filled with sedated humans, how many millions did that add to the ranks of the undead? Their situation only seemed to grow worse with every new bit of information. Xkul's warband drew the night watch, so he and Fences curled up in a free spot along the inside of the hold's wall. Fences prodded him awake a few hours later, and he found the place 4 times as crowded as before. Has Ilinver arrived yet? Xkul asked. No idea, Fences yawned. I got up 5 minutes before you did. They gave up their spot to a family that was wandering around with lost looks on their faces. Injaku assigned them to the piers, where they found that a large crowd had gathered. What's going on here? Fences asked as they swapped with a pair of sentries from Gawokoma. First batch for transport, the sentry answered. Ilinkau's hoping we can sneak out at least 1 trip before the undead notice. What were the chances of that? The undead already knew to destroy their boats. Have the undead shown up at all? Xkul asked. Nope, it's been pretty quiet. Not even a wraith to pester us like they usually do. Maybe they did have a chance. The front was huge and whatever was directing the undead couldn't be everywhere at once. Even 10 elder liches was a scarce number to control so many undead over such a wide area. Xkul and Fences took their place in the line of sentries along the wharf. An hour later, a group of dots appeared on the eastern horizon, which rapidly resolved into river barges. Good. Ilinkau clapped his paws. Our ships are coming in, no pushing. We'll fit as many as we reasonably can. Though the crowd didn't press forward, the weight of their anticipation and anxiety felt much the same. Xkul divided his attention between the waiting civilians and the approaching ships. What? Xkul looked over his shoulder at Fence's confused voice. Some 400 meters away, one of the ships was gone. There were no flames or plumes of smoke, it had simply disappeared. I didn't see it, Xkul said. What happened? One by one, the barges sunk into the river. Their crews milled about on their decks, looking just as confused as Xkul felt before jumping overboard. They, too, vanished in turn. Can someone explain what in the world happened to those ships? Ilinkau's frustrated roar sounded over the waterfront. They just sunk. One of the other sentries said, no sign of a fight. A worried clamor rose from the crowd. Xkul was too busy watching the river's surface to see what they were doing. There were no pieces of debris or bodies floating by. Get your people moving, Elinkra called down from the nearby wall. It's clear that they aren't going to let us cross. Half of the sentries along the wharf were reorganized to help clear the way to the eastern gate. Xkel and Fencis remained, watchful for whatever had sunk their transports. How many undead do you think are in the river? Fencis said. I don't know, Xkel replied. This is really bad, isn't it? There are enough undead to push us back across the entire basin. We're cut in half by the river, but the undead can cross whenever they want. The clan lords will figure something out, Xkel told the younger hunter. We just need to help hold things together. He wasn't sure if his words were in any way convincing. No matter which way he looked at it, they were in a dire situation. Xkel's eyes went to Elinkra on the wall, who was still watching the civilians gathered along the wharf file out of the city. A con runner came up behind the Overlord, who turned and swiveled his ears toward the newcomer. 10 minutes passed before Njaka came down to speak to the members of his warband stationed along the wharf. The undead are on the move, he said. They left the city 2 hours ago. Are we having everyone vacate this hold, then? Xkel asked. Not right away, Njaka shook his head. The people need a bit of rest or they'll be collapsing on the road. At their current rate, the undead will reach this hold in a day, but Elinver is conducting a fighting withdrawal. Hopefully, that will slow things down enough that we can get the civilians out of this alive. But the warriors need to rest, too. Elinver's already issued orders for that. In the morning, the warriors here will head out and begin skirmishing in the forward forces place. Elinver's forces will rest here and prepare the defenses for whenever the undead arrive. We'll head to the next hold once the undead reach this one and repeat. Xkel tried to remember how many walled holds there were to the easternmost city. That will get us 5 days at this rate? Fencis said, our slowest needs 6. If we stall for 4 hours at every hold, Njaka said, that should get us enough time. The fastest civilian groups will get there in 2 days, so we may even receive reinforcements at some point. Don't we still have undead moving on the flanks? If we try to stall our part of the front, we're going to end up in the situation we withdrew to avoid in the first place. We know, their lord rumbled grimly. But that is what we must do to protect our people. The best we can do about the flanks for now is to have hunters screen for approaching undead. Who knows, killing tens of thousands of undead a day may completely siphon away their strength before this fight gets very far. That would be nice, Xkel grunted. What about Natorika? Do we know what they're doing yet? No, Njaka shook his head, but since they sent those boats, they should at least have some idea of what's going on here. Elinkra just sent a few hunters to update them on our situation. Will they make it with undead watching the water now? Fencis asked. They haven't been able to detect any of our decent hunters so far, Njaka said. We should be able to establish some lines of communication soon. He hoped it would be the case. Despite all of their preparations prior to the undead advance, everything their forces did a mere day after it started was more improvisation than anything else. For now, Njaka told them, you're to continue carrying out your duties. Once your watch is over, get as much rest as possible. We're going to have a long fight ahead of us. 22nd day, Middle Wind Month, 1 CE, Captain, Squads 9 through 21 have finished reporting in. What did they discover? The major points are effectively identical, Psycho said. They await your orders. Ludmilla sighed. The 4 temple staff members lined up in front of her echoed her sigh. The beastmen leaving countless intoxicated humans in their wake probably delayed the royal army's advance more than any conventional strategy they could have used. Have we received a response from Countess Corlin's delegation yet? She asked. No, Psycho answered, but this is not a situation our forces are equipped to handle regardless. She wasn't sure if anyone in the theater was equipped to handle the situation, never mind the Elder Liches and Death Series servitors. A mere day into their operation, they already had over 100,000 poisoned citizens on their hands. From a tactical perspective, the Beastmen's use of the wild Lera variant worked in the Royal Army's favor. The effect of the plant was such that the afflicted citizens didn't even care to move and the undead advance didn't allow the Beastmen the luxury of moving them. Immobilizing them with paralyzing levels of terror proved unnecessary. The citizens were already experiencing paralyzing levels of euphoria. While this effectively secured the Draconic Kingdom's citizens for them, it also left the army with a countryside filled with intoxicated invalids. Their state was such that they just stayed awake until they collapsed from exhaustion and soiled themselves wherever they languished. They wouldn't eat or drink unless someone was actively nursing them. "Resume our advance," Ludmilla said. "Have the sergeants continue to report their findings. Let me know as soon as they notice any changes in the state of the citizenry." "Acknowledged, Captain." Psycho turned away before flying off to see to his tasks. Ludmilla turned her attention back to the temple staff. As with what she had witnessed across the Draconic Kingdom, the town's strongest citizens were culled through purposeful effort, leaving the young and inexperienced behind. Of the four, 3 were acolytes, while the other had been ordained for less than a year. Ludmilla's gaze went past their shoulders to the open door of the warehouse behind them. She walked past the group, stopping at the first of several wagons within. She reached into one of the sacks in its cargo, withdrawing a somewhat intact sample of the crushed plants stored inside. She turned and presented it to the eldest, a young woman from the Temple of Bounty. "Have any of you seen this plant before?" she asked. The temple staff passed the plant between them. All of them shook their heads after a brief examination. "We've never seen it before," the woman said. "Can it be assumed that this is responsible for the state of our townsfolk?" "It is," Ludmilla said. "This is a wild variant of Lera, the plant refined into what is commonly known as black dust." "Black dust," the woman breathed. "We recognized the symptoms, but it's hard to imagine something from Reesties ending up here during all this." Ludmilla frowned inwardly at the reply, wondering if the mental map of those in the Draconic Kingdom simply had a label with narcotics slapped on top of the kingdom in the region's northwest. The arbitrary response, however, demonstrated something odd, something that Lord Mayor had pointed out to her about job classes. By his explanation, every job class was an appropriately themed bundle of knowledge, skills and abilities. She had no reason to believe that he was lying, but it was still difficult to accept and hard to prove. The juxtaposition of different job class specialities playing out before her was likely as good an example as one could normally get. According to Queen Auriculus, Lera did not grow in the Draconic Kingdom, neither did it see distribution from other human countries. Thus, the cleric referred to it through its association with Reesties. At the same time, however, she recognized the symptoms. "Did everyone else recognize the symptoms?" Ludmilla asked. All of the temple staff nodded. The youngest of them was 6 or 7, so Ludmilla couldn't imagine her being educated in narcotics that she wouldn't ever be expected to see. The answer to the anomalous knowledge lay in the fact that job classes in the healer category could innately assess and identify ailments afflicting their patients, or targets as Lord Mayor called them. This expertise was dependent on their level and several other factors, but, as Lera was a mundane plant with mundane effects, even acolytes gained basic job class insights on its effects. Whether they could do something about them was dependent on whether they knew the requisite treatment, which was, in turn, dependent on their level and the spells that they had access to. Rather than the effects of Lera being something they had studied about or seen before, the diagnosis was something that they felt. From there, their minds worked backwards to come up with the most plausible rationale for their insight. In the priest's case, the common knowledge of the drug's presence in Reesties led to it being the source, despite their information being based on rumors of faraway lands. If one were to ask a ranger, they wouldn't be able to so accurately assess the symptoms of the afflicted without learned expertise. The closest it would probably be was poisoned or sick. They could, however, look at the plant and innately understand that it was dangerous in some way. Their knowledge of poisons could also lead to figuring out some ranger-related use for it. A ranger's knowledge of nature also gave a sense of the conditions that the plant required to grow, and they would then use that insight in combination with their experience and knowledge to identify the closest probable source. When Ludmilla examined the plant, her immediate conclusion was not that it came from Reesties despite her witnessing its cultivation and abuse in and around Facet County. Instead, it was that it either grew naturally in the semi-arid wilderness south of the Empire, or the mountain valleys between the Orichalon Basin and the vast desert to its south. At the same time, she somehow knew that it couldn't grow in the Draconic Kingdom, even though its southern provinces were an ideal climate for it. Nothing said that it couldn't grow in both of the other places. Mundane plants didn't pick and choose where they grew, after all, and she did recall seeing it growing alongside the other vegetation during her time with the Empire's 5th and 6th Army groups. However, since the highly territorial Wyvern Rider tribes were in the way and the south was more accessible to the Beastmen anyway, That the Lera came from the ranges to the Draconic Kingdom's southeast became the logical conclusion. If one presented the sample to a job class with natural knowledge and the eye of a healer, such as a druid, they would be able to identify the effects of Lera on their patient and accurately point out the regions where it likely grew, so long as they knew those regions existed. A druid in the Empire would say it was from the land south of the Wyvern Mark or some similar environment in the Carnassus region. One in the Draconic Kingdom would say it was from the mountains bordering the Draconic Kingdom's southern provinces. The existence of this job class mechanism was naturally exploited by many cultures. In particular, the occasional appearance of travelers in tribal societies allowed individuals to combine their job class insights with new experiences and knowledge, and those travelers would then return to their tribes with beneficial new ideas, technologies and magic. Smith Kovalev was another example of a traveler in human society, as was Leanne Wagner, who had seen the world from the Holy Kingdom of Roblé to the Great Steppe. In a way, Ludmilla's work was turning her into a traveler too. But how did it affect so many people? The Cleric of Bounty asked. The beastmen didn't force us to take it, nor did they burn it in the streets. They dumped it in your wells, Ludmilla answered. By the looks of it, multiple sacks at a time. Those who consume black dust usually sprinkle a pinch derived from a far less potent cultivar into a cup of water. We have no idea how long it will take for your groundwater to clear, so it's advised to draw water from the nearest running source. Barring that, you'll need to cast purify food and drink on any water that you draw from the wells. No wonder we weren't afflicted, the priest said. Purifying temple water is routine. I don't think we're going to have enough mana to do it for the whole town, though. Once the effects aren't so severe, the citizens will be evacuated west across the Forst. You won't have to deal with it there. What's important right now is that everyone avoids taking additional doses of your tainted water supply. The row of temple staff nodded in understanding. Ludmilla smiled at how docile they had become. Just 30 minutes previous, two of them tried to turn the Death Knights sweeping the plaza. The youngest one threw a vial of holy water at Ludmilla. Why it had been aimed at her and not Psycho, who was standing right beside her, was a mystery. She wasn't sure she wanted to ask. In all, however, they had the making of good clerics. They could have fled with the beastmen, but instead chose to stay with the people they served. With the town's affairs in order, Ludmilla flew up to join Psycho, and, after one last look at the town from above, they flew southeast. We need more living staff to support our operations, Ludmilla said. At this rate, we're going to spend more time dealing with the citizens being left behind than commanding the army. This situation is unique, is it not? Psycho asked. I'm not so sure about that. This most recent development aside, the undead horde should be one of our default strategies. It's a convenient bundle of preconceptions that we should exploit at every relevant opportunity. Then, in the future, what would be required? Logistics officers to start with, but that's something that will fix itself as our army raises more commanders. We'll also have to collaborate with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to produce some sort of public relations division. The latter is probably crucial for us going forward. The need for logistics officers had already been identified by Captain Gunner, and it was a role that couldn't be fulfilled by the undead beyond the basic tasks that the undead handled. As for public relations, the Frost Giant's preferred form of diplomacy was performed with an axe. Seemingly the whole army was like that, including Lord Cocytus, so there was a glaring hole in that department. Is diplomacy on the field truly necessary? Our work is where diplomacy has the greatest impact, Ludmilla said. In times of peace, people can talk in pointless circles forever, offering everything, yet nothing at the same time. In war, civil diplomacy is optional, but what is sown on the battlefield will be remembered for generations or even longer. With our cultural disadvantage, we'll want to employ every weapon available to achieve our foreign policy goals. Psycho's robes fluttered in the wind as he flew on in silence. Ludmilla wondered if those aspects of statecraft would ever matter to the Elder Liches. That in itself was another undeniably useful facet of the undead horde strategy. Every imaginable behavior expected of the undead would be met with no complaints by their enemies because there was usually no one to complain to. Thus, the Sorceress Kingdom's undead servitors could pursue their goals in their telltale undead way. She assumed that it would eventually only work on occasion, however. As the Sorceress Kingdom expanded its influence, More and more of its neighbors would associate the undead with them rather than any natural cause. Additionally, if the Sorceress Kingdom didn't arbitrarily wreak havoc everywhere, observers who were aware of the big picture could easily link the appearance of the undead to the Sorceress Kingdom's agendas. In the end, they would be limited to plausible areas with negative zones similar to the Katza Plains, if they existed. Even if they did, the resident undead might not take kindly to their home being used as a staging ground for a foreign power. It wouldn't do for a nation that counted the undead amongst its citizens to not get along with other undead-friendly states. The Orichalon loomed ever larger as they flew south, and they arrived over the highway along its northern bank late in the afternoon. Above them, the low-hanging clouds threatened to dump sheets of rain over the land. Below, tens of thousands of undead shambled forward at roughly 1.5 kilometers per hour. Her eyes followed the highway east to the next town, which was roughly 15 kilometers away. Beyond the town, a long stream of beastmen were already making their way further east. "It looks like they intend to carry on with this strategy," she said. "The General Staff has mixed opinions on whether their growing numbers will encourage them to mount a major offensive soon," Psycho said. "Well, our job is to keep that from happening." Due to the way that the Royal Army was advancing, the beastmen couldn't flee north or south into the mountains along the edges of the Orichalon Basin. She was fairly certain that most of them wouldn't have anyway, as both the humans and beastmen used the basin's expansive river system as the principal mode of travel. As the hours passed, more and more of the retreating beastmen reached the banks of the Orichalon. The ships that they expected to use, however, had been denied to them. With that, the Royal Army's broad initiative resulted in the conflict being set on a solid course. The beastmen were being funneled up the river and their forces were divided in half by the impassable Orichalon. All that was left was to sort them out, which they were doing nicely on their own. "What are we facing in the town ahead?" Ludmilla asked. The most recent estimates are up to 3 sets of 20,000 beastmen operating in their respective tribal warbands. They are currently cycling their forces for the evening shift. At first, the beastmen had divided into 2 armies that took turns resisting the undead advance. They didn't form the same sort of army as humans did, instead using a warband system that was highly specialized in raiding and skirmishing. That was from a human perspective, however. The Frost Giants saw it as a more normal way to conduct war, and she expected that many demi-humans would think so as well. "How many are they losing to our wraith harassment?" "Roughly 500 per hour. They are gaining new warriors faster than our combined summons are killing them." "It's just one part of a rapidly compounding problem for them," Ludmilla said. "We'll be picking up the pace soon." Though she called it harassment, it was more reconnaissance in force. The Elder Lich's sergeants weren't participating in combat, so they spent their mana on summons that both killed beastmen and updated their overall picture of the front. 2 hours passed before the beastmen's fresh forces started harassing the fringes of the undead horde's advance. She watched over 3 dozen warbands pop up along different parts of the front, using slings to whittle down the massive weak undead. They had the same risk-averse approach as they carried since the front developed, retreating whenever the undead came within a few hundred meters. While it appeared that the undead were taking one-sided losses with every assault, the whittling down part was mostly an illusion. The Elder Liches controlling the dominated forces were padding the leading fringe with summoned undead and true losses were negligible. As the sunset and twilight settled over the land, Ludmilla made her first move. "Let's begin. Elder Liches, cast fog cloud. Make sure they connect properly." Blotches of thick white mist started to appear below her, obscuring the landscape below. Fog cloud was a second-tier spell that conjured a 6-meter radius cloud of fog that emanated from a point of a caster's choosing. The spell lasted 3 minutes per level, so each cloud conjured by the Royal Army's powerful black counterfeiters would last 105 minutes. Relatively speaking, it was a cheap spell, and the Elder Liches could combine their efforts to create a fog bank that covered the undead army's advance. The skirmishing beastmen immediately faltered at the sight of the white mist. One of the main benefits of the spell was that it limited vision to 2 meters. As the fog was conjured, even Ludmilla's true sight couldn't see through it. Once the fog bank started to roll forward, the skirmishers pulled back. "Infantry squads, advance with the fog. Stay inside of it." Her Death Series servitors marched forward. Each squad's zombie retinues spread out into the fog while the Death Knights and Death Warriors mingled with them. One of the advantages of having Beastman zombies was that they were about the same height as Death Series servitors, making it difficult to differentiate between a level 1 zombie and a level 35 Death Knight in the mist. Their shrouded advance continued mostly unchallenged for the next 3 kilometers. Hopeful hunters sent bullets into the wall of fog, but nearly all of their attacks failed to hit anything but the ground. Eventually, several warbands came together, their lords conferring with one another on how to tackle the new tactic. After a few minutes, they dispersed and approached. "Here they come. Send some zombies ahead. See if you can't draw them toward you." The beastmen couldn't see through the fog and the undead couldn't see out of it, but Ludmilla could see each side from above. Dozens of zombies appeared at the edge of the cloud, and the beastmen reacted instantly. The warbands tore into their flimsy opponents and ripped their way deeper into the fog. Their savage war cries were joined by the unearthly howls of Death Knights, and the harsh chorus carried over the countryside. "Kill as many as you can. Don't worry if it's sloppy, we have plenty of prey ahead of us." Several minutes later, the sounds of battle died down. Ludmilla watched the leading edge of the fog for fleeing beastmen. In the distance, the beastmen on the town's walls also awaited the outcome. "All sergeants report the resolution of combat," Psycho said. "All enemies have been neutralized and razed, but our forces will not be able to keep up with the cost in zombies." "I don't think this will go on for too long," Ludmilla replied. After her dismal results in generating fear in River Garden, she decided that trying too hard was counterproductive and thinking too hard about it was pointless. With the assault on the city behind them, she had her center force assume the same stance as they had in the west while she dealt with the mess that the beastmen left behind in every town and village. From what she could see, however, that reversion to their old tactics produced more promising results than the overt slaughter of the urban assault. As Elishnish once mentioned, ambush predators enjoyed stalking, but they despised being stalked. Shocking the beastmen into a state of terror, and the Draconic Kingdom's citizens, for that matter, didn't work in the long run, but the way they were doing things now tapped into a different sort of response. It was a creeping, primal fear that always lurked in the corner of one's mind. Nothing flashy was required, only the feeling that they were being hunted, the thought that something was tracking them over the horizon or following them from out of sight, ever ready to pounce. In many ways, it was just her thing. She was an undead ranger, or a hunter in the beastmen's tribal terms. Now, her task was to hunt her quarry with an army. The fog bank closed within 3 kilometers of the town, yet the beastmen still appeared paralyzed with indecision. At 2 kilometers, they started to withdraw. "Infantry squads, advance at a jog. Don't worry about leaving your zombies behind. Elder Liches, keep that fog ahead of our infantry." "This one does not understand," Psycho said. "Fog cloud does render their ranged skirmishing tactics ineffective, but beastmen favor melee combat. This should not have been such an extreme deterrent." "Are those the words of the General Staff?" "No. A personal assessment. A deterrent doesn't have to be extreme to work. In this case, the enemy that they planned to face became a complete unknown. Furthermore, our forces continued to move with conviction. I think most sensible commanders would try to figure out what was going on before committing their forces, and we didn't give them enough time to do so. Thus, they withdrew to avoid falling for whatever trap or scheme was in play." Below them, the infantry squad stormed the walls. Ludmilla did a rough count of the remaining beastmen forces trying to get out. "Conceal the gate with fog. Fireball the opening." The white fog that appeared flared with an angry orange glow as 6 fireballs promptly incinerated the hundreds of tightly packed beastmen pushing through the gate. Death Knights reached those reeling back from the inferno, butchering them on the spot. "The town has been secured," Psycho said. "Shall we enter a consumption phase?" "No." Ludmilla looked up the highway. "Resume our pursuit. Set our pace to 21 kilometers per day and resume harassment with wraiths. Avoid targeting the civilians as usual. 21 kilometers per day will have us catch up to their slowest civilians. Are we to still leave them alone at that point?" "No, they can be killed. The goal is to wring every last bit of strength out of them before they collapse and are overtaken. Those that are killed and erased will be sent to chase down those who left them behind. Our Elder Lich controllers should have some free space, so use ghasts to raise more ghouls and ghasts for them to dominate. Repeat the process until we run out of Irma and Na targets. Once that happens, increase our pace to catch up with the Osalo group. This is the last night of sleep that they will ever get. Why? Wait. Please. A voice called from behind Xkul. He turned and sent a bullet into an Irma zombie that emerged from the mist. The owner of the voice, a female Nar with emerald eyes, gave him a pleading look. I can't, she said weakly. Help me, please. Xkul sent another bullet into a figure in the mist. The Nar fell forward. He, she panted into the mud. Please. He gritted his teeth and looked away. The tearful moans of the Nar female haunted his footsteps. Then, the mist caught up with her and the moans turned into screams. She was only one of many. All across the front, the Nar and Irma struggled to stay ahead of the creeping mist. They ran until they could run no more, and then they walked until they collapsed and the mist took them. The Nar female reappeared, dashing straight for him. Her coat of stripes was torn and her eyes glowed red. Xkul's bullet found the ghoul's chest and it erupted into a spray of rancid viscera. The stench reached a nearby Irma, who gagged and doubled over, retching involuntarily. And, then, the mist took him too. Well, that's some timing there. He looked up at the starless sky. It was probably midnight. How long were they going to be fighting for? Xkul glanced toward Fences, who was fighting a dozen meters away. Like him, the young hunter was stuck in a state where he watched Nar and Irma collapse from exhaustion, disappear amidst heart-rending screams, and then reappear as undead. Fences sent a look his way. He knew what he was thinking. Defending the civilians was a futile effort. The insidious nature of the undead was in full force. They were slow, yet they never tired. It was almost as if they were created to extract the maximum amount of anguish, suffering and despair out of the living. We're pulling out. His ears swiveled toward Njaka's voice. He wasn't the only one that heard him. No. Don't leave us. Please. You warriors are supposed to fight. Where is your honor? I'm sorry. The chieftain cried, we must do what is best for Roland Gork. You cannot outrun the undead and we are still days away from our destination. Losing warbands here means that there will be that many fewer fighting when the clans are ready to fight. With one last sorry, the Overlord turned and left. The rest of the warband followed. Xkul fell onto the stones of the road. What? Xkul. He stared up at the darkness. Blinding pain pulsed from his right hip. Xkul. We need a mystic over here. What happened? Xkul asked through a haze of agony. It's a metal arrow? Fences said, no, it's shorter. A quarrel. It got you in the hip. Hey. We need a mystic over here. I didn't know the undead used crossbows, Xkul groaned. The mystics won't come. They ran out of mana hours ago. The pale mist flowed over his legs. Fences reached down to help him up. A ghast appeared from the fog and bowled the younger hunter over, biting and clawing with wild abandon. A second one came to attack Xkul. When Fences finally fought it off, he kicked the one on Xkul away. Let's get out of here. Fences looked around before kneeling beside him. I'll help you up. Just go, Xkul said. I can't move my right leg at all. You're not carrying me all the way back to the jungle. I don't have to. The mystics will heal you up long before then. Another set of undead came out of the mist. Xkul turned his head to count them. There were 5 ghasts, 8 ghouls and dozens of zombies. One of the zombies was much stronger than the rest. Leave me, Xkul shouted, we're both dying at this rate. You heard the chief's orders. With a frustrated curse, Fences fled. Xkul wondered if he could at least kill a few zombies in his wretched state. To his surprise, and his extended suffering, death didn't come. The undead ran right past him, chasing after Fences. Others similarly went by as if Xkul was nothing more than a pebble on the road. He sighed, lying flat on his back as the rain poured down on him. Cold dread collected in the pit of his stomach as his body seemed to take on a fever. That damn ghast infected me. No wonder they left me alone. How long would it take? His hip was shattered, so he couldn't move. No help would be coming. He could only lie there and wait. Suddenly, he realized that someone was standing over him. He squeezed his eyes shut several times, unsure if he was seeing things in his feverish delirium. A human? It looked like a human, but her scent was weak. A human female in some sort of white armor. In her right hand was a spear-like weapon. Xkul's eyes settled on its blade, which glowed with a ghostly light. Kill me, he croaked, then coughed. The weapon drifted over, its blade hovering over his neck. "What is your name, Hunter?" the human asked. "Xkul," he answered. "Xkul Lapinui." He closed his eyes, waiting for her killing stroke. When it didn't come, he opened them again to find that the human had withdrawn the weapon. "Kill me, damn it," he said, "give me a warrior's death." The words died in his mouth as the strong zombie from before appeared behind the human, hefting a black crossbow. Upon closer inspection, it wasn't a zombie at all. Since it didn't attack her, Xkul could only assume that the human wasn't a human at all, but one of the undead. "I'll be leaving you as you are," she said. "You know why, yes? You can feel the fever taking you, weakening you by the minute." "No," he groaned. "No. Kill me." Xkul's chest heaved. The not-human knelt beside him, stroking his head with a warm hand. Warm? Is she human, after all? Maybe it's the fever. "Worry not, Xkul," she smiled. "All things must die. And for you, a new hunter waits at the end of life." He felt his very being shrink away. It's her. The presence behind the elder liches. The cause for the undead horde's sudden change in disposition. The slowly growing darkness creeping out of the corners of his mind. It was all her. Tears streamed from Xkul's eyes as despair took him. Death stalked the land, his people were her quarry,